Ooh, Howie Man fucking do. Howie Mandel can suck it. Oh hey, how you doing? Didn't see you there. Didn't realize we had started. Too busy playing with stupid little Gremlins toys. You know. Welcome, welcome to the holiday edition of Romper Review Sunday Story Time. We're here. We have a very special this week because I was playing with the Gremlin. Fuck Howie Mandel. We have Gremlins. We have the novelization of Gremlins. And let me tell you what, this is something special. It adds so much more, actually. Men in Black 2 was pretty damn straightforward and pretty by the book. 100% the same as the movies. But, this is different. This is, adds a lot of exposition, adds a lot of fun to it. For the... LeBron, stay out of the house. Don't come in my house. Just start setting up trees places. Singing songs. Oh. LeBron can do whatever LeBron wants. Right. Sprite cranberry? Sure, we'll have a Sprite cranberry. Howie Mandel is no good for Gizmo. I'm the new Gizmo. They need to give it to me from now on. Whatever things are going on with Gizmo, that's me. I don't care how good it is. It may not be good. Who cares? I'll be better than Howie. So, yeah. Make sure that when dealing with gremlins that you always heed the 3 warnings. Do not expose them to light. Do not get them wet. Above all, no matter how hard they cry, no matter how much they beg, do not feed them past midnight. So yeah, this book was written back then around that time. So, it's got some colorful language and things like that. But yeah, this is a novel by George Gipe, based on a screenplay written by Chris Columbus. Not the asshole Christopher Columbus, the one that wanted to come and settle the new world. Wink wink. But a different one. A major motion picture from Warner Brothers. It even has color photos from the movie. I would like to read something beforehand. Yeah, in reading this book, there's some interesting, colorful language. So, yeah, this novel contains negative descriptions and depictions of people or cultures. Rather than alter the text, I want to acknowledge that these stereotypes have a harmful impact, and it was as wrong then as it is now. And it's pretty stereotypical at times. I'm presenting it as it is. So, come in halfway through, refer to the beginning. Not trying to hurt anyone's feelings or make anyone feel bad or anything. This is the book as it's presented. So, without further ado, Steven Spielberg presents Gremlins, a novel by George Gipe, based on a screenplay by Chris Columbus. Special thanks to the people who helped him make his job gremlin free. Elaine Markson, Catherine Voigt, Dan Romanelli, Mike Fennell, Joe Dante, Brad Globe, Jeffrey Brandt, Judy Gittenstein, Ed Cedarbaum. Gremlins. Chapter 1. In his cage, tucked in a far corner of the Chinese man's back room, the Mogwai dozed fitfully. Soon the old man would come in, stroke him gently, speak briefly in that strange sounding language, set him free to wander amongst the musty books and artifacts for a while, and then, best of all, feed him. As a mogwai, he was nearly always ready to eat, though he had learned to control his hunger. Such was the built-in adaptability of the mogwai. He was so adaptable that even though confined to the cage and small room, he felt no desire for freedom. In fact, his mind was his escape mechanism, a perennially active entertainment center which he could use to visit any time or place, at any time at all. His mind was not like the human mind, a perverse instrument, which so often refused manipulation, but played tricks or dealt its owner doses of duplicity. The mogwai's mind, in sharp contrast, was a constant source of pleasure to him. Mogtermen, the inventor of the mogwai species, had seen to that. Centuries ago, on another planet, Mogtermen had set out to produce a creature that was adaptable to any climate and condition, one that could easily reproduce itself, was gentle and highly intelligent. Exactly why Mogtermen embarked on this venture is not known, except that such inventors flourished during an era of widespread experimentation in the field of species creation, an era, it should be added, that passed into disrepute following later. Unsuccessful attempts to introduce cross-pollination among certain species of crawling carnivores. What a saying. Mantis Toboggan in the house. What's up, dude? You're the best doctor. At first, Mogtermen's experiment had been looked upon as a great success, and he was hailed as the genetic hero of 3 galaxies. The first sets of mogwai turned out as planned, although the gentle little beasts had a few drawbacks not foreseen by their creator. Their vast intelligence seemed to interfere with the ability to communicate. Mogtermen said it was because they thought so much faster than they could verbalize. And for some unaccountable reason, they were repelled by light. Discounting these deficiencies, the galactic powers ordered the mogwai sent to every inhabitable planet in the universe, their purpose being to inspire alien beings with their peaceful spirit and intelligence, and to instruct them in the ways of living without violence and possible extinction. Among the planets selected for early mogwai population were Kelm 6 in the Peristi Range, Klimpf A of the Beehive Pollux, and the third satellite of minor sun number 67672, a small but fertile body called Earth by its inhabitants. Soon after these first departures, it was discovered that Mogtermen's creatures were highly unstable. To be exact, fewer than 1 in 1,000 retained the sweet disposition and charitable aims built into it by the inventor. Instead, something went wrong. Very wrong. The mogwai himself knew of the unstable mogwai, being well versed in the historical background of his species. He preferred not to think of the complications that had developed, but it was nearly impossible not to. It was, after all, part of his heritage. Closing his eyes as he relaxed in his cage awaiting his supper, he mused briefly on the wars, landslides, and famines that had taken place on Kelm 6, Klimpf A, and even here on Earth, because of his creator's miscalculations and willingness to disseminate an untested creature. Small wonder Mogtermen had been punished by having his... The mogwai pushed the thought through his mind. True, Mogtermen had failed in the overall, but he himself was one of the successes, the 1 in 1,000 who still embodied all the good things put there by his high-minded inventor. Yet his existence, he knew, had no long-term benefits for society. Gentle as he was a distinct threat to those around him. Just a few drops of water, a morsel of food at the wrong time, and... The mogwai made a little guttural noise, unhappy with himself for allowing such unpleasant thoughts to enter his trained mind. Why was he even considering the possibility that he might bring about some disaster or other? The Chinese man seemed to understand the rules. Although the mogwai was at a loss to explain how he knew them, other than by the fact that Orientals seemed to understand the inexplicable without even trying. He kept the room dark, water-free, and fed the mogwai well before midnight. Few strangers were admitted. The mogwai was never subjected to journeys such as those he had been forced to endure with his previous owners, among whom were a medieval peddler and a 16th century smuggler who sold stolen gems. Quite a life. No doubt about it, the Chinese man was the best caretaker of them all. But why then was the mogwai filled with a sense of malaise at best, of impending doom at worst? Perhaps, he mused, it was because he had it so easy for so long. Thinking back, he wondered if he had the strength to deal once again with a new outbreak of them. What do you mean, of them? He asked himself, suddenly realizing that they and he were virtually the same, except that Mogterman's miscalculations were built into them. And built into me as well, he thought, feeling guilty. I just happened to be the one who escaped. As he had done so many times in the past, he began to wonder what had happened to the others, how long they had survived, how much trouble they had caused. No, he thought, forcing his mind to erase the coalescing picture. That's not to think about. It will take a mental tour instead, a tour of the beautiful Celestian fire streams. Catalesian fire streams. He closed his eyes, and his mogwai mind, ever obedient, began to show him the vivid colors generated by the boiling rivers of the subplanet Catalesia. It was one of the mogwai's favorite mental images. Although he felt a minor surge of aggression, he enjoyed watching mind battles between the armored worms of Eucursian. His favorite earthly visions included the sun-darkening flights of the passenger pigeon, which he understood had ended a century before, and scenes of the San Francisco earthquake. He was curled into a ball, thoroughly enjoying the mental spectacle of the Catalesian fire streams, when the Chinese man entered. A small plate held in his thin fingers, the frail gentleman with skin like old leather shuffled quietly to the side of the table and stood looking down into the cage of his furry friend. On the plate was an assortment of oriental delicacies left over from Han Wu's restaurant next door. A partial egg roll, rice, broccoli, and twice fried pork scraps. To all this, the Chinese man had added a small rubber washer he had found in his handy room closet. Aware of his master's presence, the mogwai stirred, opened his eyes, then pounced to an expectant standing position as the food's aroma suddenly reached him. Smiling benevolently, the Chinese man opened the door from the top and reached inside to gently lift the mogwai onto the table. He deposited him next to the plate and nodded. "You may enjoy yourself now, my friend," he said softly, patting the mogwai gently on the head, and then taking a step backwards. The mogwai looked down at the plate. Sure enough, a foreign object was there again. Yesterday it had been a piece of soft, chewy wood. The day before, a couple of foamy white chips he had seen the Chinese man take from a packing crate. Sniffing at the black rubber donut, the mogwai analyzed it instantly and knew it would not hurt him if he ate it. He also knew it would be tasteless at best, perhaps bitter, virtually nutritionless, and very hard to chew. But the Chinese man so enjoyed seeing him chew up non-edible substances that it seemed churlishly uncharitable to disappoint him. Getting the black object down would take only a minute. He could then enjoy the rest of his meal as dessert. Snapping up the washer, he pulled it inside his mouth and started to grind away, first using the back teeth as a vice to break the dry object in half. As he suspected, it was tough and tasted rather like petroleum. Not his favorite flavoring agent, but the mogwai enjoyed seeing the expression of amazement and happiness crinkle the old man's features. Less than a minute later, the washer swallowed, if not digested. He was busily and eagerly attacking the rice and egg roll. Glancing up briefly, the mogwai saw the pleased smile lingering on the Chinese man's face and was glad he had taken the trouble to eat the washer. Humoring the old man, after all, was a small enough price to pay for a peaceful life he led. Backstory, wow. What? Who'd have thunk they had a whole backstory? That's the cool part. That's the fun part. The lore of the Gremlins. I have this mug of this giant-sized gremlin here. Chewbacca, you could almost call him a gremlin. Ew. You can see the colorful language in that. Chapter 2. For a long moment, Billy resisted the urge to deliver a good swift kick to the side of his perverse Volkswagen. Then he lashed out, driving his boot solidly against the rusting spot near the rear fender met the car's body. He was immediately sorry, not just because he was rewarded with a jolt of pain in his toe. The car, a '69, was old and usually provided him with reasonable, dependable transportation. The heating vent resisted all efforts to open and close according to Billy's will, but had to be either opened all the way or jammed completely shut. There were various shudders and groans that tried Billy's patience, but as they were all intermittent, a term used by garagemen when they were unable to find the trouble's source, he and the car somehow adjusted to each other. But why did it always seem to conk out when he was late for work? Last night had been just as cold, perhaps colder than this morning. He hadn't especially wanted the pizza, and he certainly experienced no joy in being the one selected to go get it. Why hadn't the bug coughed and sputtered and died then? He sighed, looked at his watch, and winced. If he could be shot directly out of a cannon into the bank, he would be only a minute late. He glanced about him. The streets of quaint Kingston Falls, population 6,122, were deserted, as they always seemed to be when you needed a lift or were looking for company. Excuse me. Some might have called it a boring town, but having lived all his 21 years here, Billy liked it. He and Kingston Falls somehow seemed right for each other, having down-to-earth qualities in common. When his mother used to say things like, "That Billy Peltzer of a few years ago had often grown sulky, dispirited, and occasionally hostile," now he realized he was average. A, B minus, or B plus, depending on the taste of the feminine onlooker. His hair, dark and worn as long as his bank executives would allow, framed a longish face, a pair of dark, earnest eyes, and a wide, expressive mouth. His skin, he thanked the Lord, had passed the acne stage. Either that or the zits were in a state of remission. Definitely not muscular. He was too well filled out to be called wiry. His was the body that even a high school football coach would have difficulty assigning a position. He was too small for the line, a bit too clunky for the whippet-like receivers, not quite strong enough for running back, and so, because Kingston Falls put more emphasis on participation than winning, Billy Peltzer spent 2 years in the school's defensive backfield. The high point of his career came not when he intercepted a pass and ran it back for the game-winning touchdown, but when he recovered a fumble that salvaged a tie, all that stood between Kingston Falls and a totally winless season. After graduating, he didn't go to college because he simply didn't know what he wanted to be in life, and it seemed a shame to have his folks shell out good money while he decided. Following in his father's footsteps would have been like tracking a squirrel through the forest. Part inventor, part traveling salesman, Rand Peltzer had a resume that resembled the parts list of an aircraft carrier. Billy knew he didn't want a similarly nomadic existence. Yet he was so hard-pressed to define his goals that his friend Gene Grenkiewicz, now nearly through engineering college, once suggested that he try to become a day watchman at the drive-in theater. Instead, Billy took a post-high school aptitude test, which revealed that he would do well working in a bank. The test did not say how well he would do if he continued to arrive late, however. "Broke down again?" The voice, a familiar one, belonged to Murray Futterman, a garrulous neighbor around the corner who was now seated behind the wheel of his bright red snowplow. Whenever it snowed, Futterman hopped on his plow and helped clean the streets, partly as a public service, and partly, Billy suspected, because it gave him a better opportunity to jaw with people. "You need a jump, Billy?"
No, thanks, Billy replied. It's not the battery. I just put a new one in. I think it's the connection. Or it's just made up its mind to be stubborn for a while.
Futterman pulled on his brake and descended from the snowplow's fur-lined seats. Inwardly, Billy groaned, knowing he had no time to waste. Futterman went well, but he could use 10 minutes telling a 30-second story.
Thanks, Mr. Futterman,
Billy said quickly, walking away from his car and toward the street in the hopes of sidetracking the well-intentioned neighbor.
I'm gonna walk. I'm already late for work now.
He might as well have just spoken in Sanskrit or performed a few bird imitations. Nodding genially as he brushed past him, Futterman looked closely at the Volkswagen.
No good foreign cars, he said, shaking his head. They always freeze up on you.
Billy hesitated, not yet desperate enough to just start walking to the work in the cold. Futterman was harmless and occasionally even helpful. For a long moment he stood looking at the car, his straight black hair hanging limply across his forehead. Well into his 50s, Futterman looked younger, yet because of his garrulous nature and fuddy-duddy attitude, he somehow seemed older as well.
Doesn't happen with American machinery, he said. Our stuff can stand up to anything.
No sense arguing the point, Billy thought. Forcing a tight smile, he hoped Futterman would take it as an apology for his buying such a defective foreign product and drop the subject. Billy opened his mouth to reiterate his dilemma, gesturing up to the street as he did so. The words died in the wake of Futterman's next verbal onslaught.
See that snowplow?
He said.
15 years old. Hasn't given me a day of trouble. You know why?
Obviously, it was a rhetorical question. Again, Billy's mouth opened, but no words came forth.
It's because it's not some foreign piece of junk,
Futterman answered himself.
A Kentucky harvester. You'll never see a snowplow as good as that one. Company went out of business because they were too good. Hear that, boy? Too good.
Billy shrugged. He tried to look sad. Not a difficult maneuver in light of the fact that he might be fired in a few minutes. That's real nice, Mr. Futterman, he said. I mean, it's nice it's such a great plow. And it's too bad they went out of business. But I gotta go. Really.
Hop on. I'll give you a lift, Futterman offered.
Billy weighed the situation. Nothing else on the road was moving, and as most people had not yet shoveled their sidewalks, walking was going to be slow. At least Futterman's snowplow get him to the bank faster than he could move on foot, if... Futterman homed in on Billy's hesitation.
We'll go straight to the bank,
he promised.
That's where you work, right?
Yes, sir.
Come on, I'll open her up full, and we'll be there in no time at all.
Billy hopped up next to Futterman, and they started off. As they did go, Billy groaned. What's the matter, man? Billy groaned.
What's the matter?
Futterman asked. Ma must have let Barney out, Billy said. Now he'll follow me to work. Sure enough, in an instant, the yellowish-brown mutt with the large ears, he was somewhere between a beagle and an Irish setter, had leapfrogged across the heavily drifted snow until he was next to Futterman's snowplow. His rheumy dark eyes looked up lovingly at Billy.
Want me to stop so you can take him back?
Futterman asked, his hand reaching for the brake. No, it's all right, Billy said. I can tie him up under the counter at the bank. Mr. Corbin won't like it, but if Barney's quiet, maybe we can get away with it until lunchtime. Futterman nodded and gunned the snowplow forward.
What's wrong with your car?
He asked. I'm not sure, Billy replied glumly. It's intermittent. Sometimes it works fine, even in freezing weather. Other times it won't start, even when it's nice.
Sounds like Gremlins to me.
You mean all those cars used to act like that? Futterman laughed.
Guess you're too young to recognize the word gremlin as anything but an American Motors car, he said.
What else is it?
A little devil, Futterman said. They love to fool around with machinery. I saw a lot of them in World War II. I was a tail gunner on a flying fortress. Bet you didn't know that.
Billy shook his head.
even as he tried to remember whether one of Futterman's endless ramblings had once contained this information. Looking at Futterman now and doing some quick arithmetic, he was amazed that the man was old enough to have taken part in a conflict that had ended nearly 4 decades ago. He was old, of course, but somehow Billy automatically coupled World War II veterans with men in rocking chairs or nursing homes. Compared to them, thanks, Eric. Compared to them, Futterman was very much alive. Billy said the diplomatically correct, and as it turned out, accurate thing. You must have been a teenager.
Futterman nodded. 18 when I went in, 19 when it was over. But I saw a lot in those 12 months.
I'll bet.
Most important thing I learned was that gremlins really exist. Gotta keep watching for them.
Billy couldn't suppress a smile.
You think I'm pulling your leg,
Futterman deadpanned.
but it's true. Like I said, they like to fool around with machinery. With all them planes flying, World War II was their meat. Let me tell you, those gremlins were everywhere during the war. I mean, all over our ships and planes. I think that's why our machinery's better than the foreign stuff. In the war, we learned to deal with gremlins and make our equipment better. For some reason, gremlins didn't go after the Japanese and Germans the way they went after us.
Why was that? Billy asked.
Don't know for sure, but I think it's because we, our side, had a better sense of humor. You know how human nature is. It's like, well, you only play tricks on people who will laugh, right? After a while, you don't play tricks on people who'll get all ruffled, because it's no fun. That's why the gremlins took after us. Half the time we'd end up laughing, and what did they do?
And what did they do?
You name it. Now I was a tail gunner, right? They'd knock my sights out of line so I'd miss, or they'd chisel tiny holes in the glass window so cold air would get in. They'd even slide down the gun barrel and jam the trigger as I was about to fire, or they'd stick a pin in my rear just as I was about to fire.
Billy laughed. You actually saw them?
Well, yes and no,
Futterman replied.
You'd see them out of the corner of your eye, or just as you shot them at full glance, they'd duck out of view.
Sounds like you were making them up, Mr. Futterman, Billy said candidly.
No, they were there. The other guy saw them and would swear to it. Now Jackson, he was my navigator. He used to see them outside the plane all the time, dancing in the slipstring of the wing, where they'd chew little bits of rubber out of the de-icing boot on the wing's leader edge so we'd pick up ice. Sometimes they'd make sputtering noises in the pilot's ear, so he'd think one of them engines was missing. They would even imitate our voices. Once they snuck up into our pilot and shouted, "You're flying upside down, you fool!" That was really a close one, because the pilot turned us over in a split second. You should have seen how the coffee cups and maps and people went sailing every which way.
But that could have been dangerous, Billy said. From the way you described them, I thought the gremlins were just playful.
Oh, they were. They didn't mean us in any dangerous spots like that, but some of their pranks turned out that way.
The snowplow crossed the intersection of Carver and Clark, a normally busy corner now nearly deserted except for a few cars nearly buried in drifted snow. Looking at his watch, Billy noted that he was 10 minutes late, but he was comforted by the fact that, with luck, he'd make it before the bank opened to its customers.
Before the war was over, we learned to deal with them, all kinds of them, Futterman continued. The Strato Gremlins were the worst. They used to show up above 10,000 feet. Spaniels were middle-aged gremlins, and Fifinellas were females. There were also Jerps and Midgets. Each kind was different. There was even a song we used to sing.
Fearing the worst, Billy looked away from Futterman. Nothing with mixed emotions that Barney was trotting behind them, apparently determined to follow them no matter how far they traveled. A moment later, the rasp of Futterman's snowplow engine blended off with his off-key singing voice.
When you're 1,000 miles from nowhere, and there's nothing below but the drink, it's then you'll see the gremlins, green and gabboge and gold. Male and female and neuter, gremlins both young and old. White ones will wiggle your wingtips, pale ones will muddle your flap, green ones will guzzle your glycol, females will flutter your flaps. They'll freeze up your camera shutters, they'll bite through your aileron wires. They'll bend and they'll break and they'll batter. They'll jab toasted forks in your eyes. They'll.
A giant convolution of a snowplow stunned Futterman into silence and nearly threw Billy off the side. A second explosion, accompanied by an arc of red fire, caused the engine to shudder. "Darn!" Futterman rasped. Reaching forward to turn the ignition key, he lifted himself off the seat, pulled the HUD latch, and grabbed a wrench from beneath the seat in one fluid motion.
Don't worry, I know what it is,
he apologized.
Won't take me but a minute or two to adjust that darn thing.
Billy slid to the ground, gave Barney a pat, and called across the flat hood to Mr. Futterman. I'll cut across Mrs. Deagle's, he said. Thanks a lot for taking me this far.
Won't take me a second to get this working, Futterman repeated. It's the only thing wrong with this snowplow. Don't usually act up, but I guess all this talk about gremlins brought it on.
Yeah, Billy laughed. Thanks again. Leaving Futterman with his head thrust deeply into the engine well, Billy started to trot across the vast expanse of Mrs. Deagle's lawn. A carpet of virgin snow, marred only by a few squirrel tracks, Barney followed. As he followed along the edge of the property towards a break in the iron fence, Billy noted that once again, Mrs. Deagle's place was the only piece of property in this, the main square of Kingston Falls, with no Christmas lights. Even the Union Savings and Trust Bank, his place of employment, sported a double line of holiday lights, which twinkled in bright, iconic contrast to the firm's Get Tough policy with its customers. A beeping horn and crunch of car chains against packed snow diverted Billy's attention from further thoughts of disaffection concerning his employer.
Get out of the way, you dumb cat!
From the rolled-down window of the Kingston Falls police car protruded the thin, weasel-like face of Deputy Brent. In the passenger seat, Sheriff Riley, a husky, friendly-faced man with thick, dark hair.
Move, you stupid rat with legs!
Brent yelled. The few pedestrians near the scene paused to watch. Billy, Dr. Malorino, on his way to the office, and Father Bartlett, a white-haired elderly priest. Beneath the front wheel of the police cruiser crouched a large gray tabby cat. Its refusal to move caused either fear or stubbornness. As Brent continued to shout at the cat, a stream of happy chatter emanated from the car radio, contrasting sharply with his venom. Good morning to all you late risers, the unseen voice warbled. Rockin' Ricky Rialto here with a list of school closings. But first, let's listen to a Motown Christmas classic, the Jackson 5, bringing you some chestnuts roasting on an open fire. A projected blast on the horn overwhelmed the ebullient announcer. Simultaneously, Billy darted quickly into the street and grabbed the cat. Thanks, Sheriff Riley smiled. It's one of Mrs. Deagle's, Billy said.
Well, if I'd known that, Brent groused, I'd have kept right on driving.
Fucking asshole. Riley nodded, rolled up the window, and indicated that Brent should continue driving. After checking to make sure Barney was behind him, Billy started a diagonal path towards Mrs. Deagle's front door, the squirming cat tucked firmly in the crook of his arm. Even as he did so, he noticed the edge of a living room curtain fall and her sharp, unsmiling face disappear into the dark recesses of the house. Before he arrived at the door, it opened to reveal Mrs. Deagle, clad in a singularly unattractive house dress, and obviously taken by surprise, judging from the lopsided position of her metallic auburn wig. Her lips were pursed, her expression as formidable as that reserved for an IRS agent. I told you not to walk on the grass, she said sharply. Billy cast a quick glance behind at the footprints in the snow. I didn't walk on the grass, he responded. I walked on the snow. Don't be smart, Mrs. Deagle shot back. Billy shoved the cat at her, his eyes locking on her face for only an instant. Unlike most old people, whose faces shone with character and wisdom, Mrs. Deagle's expression generated only sadness and revulsion with him. Large, tacky earrings dangled from her ears, and her eyes were outlined by thick, mascara-covered lashes through a heavy layer of ghostly white powder. Yellow teeth contrasted bizarrely with purplish-red lipstick smeared below and above the thin lips of her mouth. With her sharp, nervous gestures, she resembled an evil mannequin or puppet or some sort of creature Billy had seen in TV shows. Well, I brought your cat, he murmured softly. It was nearly run over by the police car. Mrs. Deagle took the animal, dropped it quickly to the floor behind her. The way you were carrying her, it's lucky she can still walk, Mrs. Deagle rasped. Billy shrugged. All right, get off my porch. I hope you're not waiting around for a reward. No, Mrs. Deagle, Billy replied. I guess a thank you is even too much to expect, you bitch. With that, he turned and started off the porch with Barney. As their parting shot, he half heard Mrs. Deagle shout something that making sure Barney didn't befoul any of her precious shrubs. Mostly his mind was occupied with thoughts of self-loathing. Dummy, he said aloud. He should have known better than to bother. Dropping the cat in her yard would have been good enough. And would have gotten him to work a few minutes earlier, or less late, he thought. As he turned the corner of Mrs. Deagle's property, he began to run. A movement that caused Barney to do likewise. The sudden acceleration brought the dog into contact with a large ceramic snowman, the only frivolous object the old woman allowed on her property. Crinkled and spotted with tiny fracture lines, the snowman's head had started listing to the right several years before. Now, as Barney brushed the bottom of the figure, the head leaned sharply downward, hesitated, and then rolled onto the snow. Peering at the departing figures from her dining room window, Mrs. Deagle inhaled sharply at the ceramic head of the snowman disappeared into the snow. Those destructive little beasts, she hissed. I'll get both of them for that. She watched silently as young Billy Peltzer and his dog went into the bank, a look of determination slowly replacing her expression of horror. Then, righting her wig before dining room mirror, she made the decision that had eluded her so far this morning, whether or not to brave the elements in order to take care of some business. Blast the snow, she said. It'll be worth getting my feet wet to teach those young punk a lesson. What a bitch. Mean old bitch. Verbs in a space. Joe Dante's the man. The man, oh yeah. No, we love Joe Dante in this house. He's God amongst men in my house, in my book, can do no wrong. What's better than this? Gremlins 2. The movie. I don't know about the book. Looks pretty fucking good though. Catch my breath. All right. On to chapter 3. It was always so difficult getting something truly different and exciting for his family, Rand Pelter mused, and every Christmas it got worse. Rather than grow despondent, however, he accepted selecting the proper gift as a challenge, which was the way he looked at his life in general. Rand considered himself a survivor, a grown-up boy from the poorest section of town, who, without benefit of college or any other specialized training, somehow had managed to marry the finest woman in Kingston Falls and support a family reasonably well. True, he had to scramble, but wasn't that part of life's fun? People laughed at him, and when his inventions failed to perform as they should, but didn't Didn't that make it even more enjoyable than they did work? When they did work? Now, although bothered by his inability to find the ultimate present for Billy, he was happy. He loved Christmas and everything it stood for, the bringing together spirit, the stepped up economy, the kind of mellowness, and especially the opportunity to be nice to people without them looking at you oddly. However, how he arrived in Chinatown, he was not exactly sure. He had no recollection of ordering a cabbie to take me to Chinatown, or even of deciding that he should take himself there. Probably, as he meandered through shop and mall and stall in search of the elusive, unique present, he had arrived in Chinatown almost by osmosis. He had never shopped there before, although he had visited as a tourist. But why not? Why shouldn't this be the place where he found it? Whatever it was. Interesting that a town of 6,000 has its own Chinatown. That's just an interesting observation. With a slightly puzzled expression on his round face, Rand resembled any other middle-aged shopper, a genial-faced man who might once have been quite handsome. He still possessed an attractive thick head of ruffled gray hair and penetrating green eyes. Below the neck he had aged less gracefully, the burly chest yielding to a thick waist that stopped just short of being a beer belly. Although some of his less diplomatic friends used the term occasionally. One might have imagined him as a professional football player, say a lineman who retired in 1965 and had been losing the Battle of the Bulge grudgingly. Dressed in a tweed jacket, corduroy pants, and a gray pullover sweater, he was obviously a man who put comfort over style. "There's got to be something here," he muttered. He surveyed the articles on the counter of the Chinese curio shop, a glittering array of souvenir-type items. There were ashtrays, tie pens, pen and pencil sets, even Chinatown toilet paper. Above him twinkled mobiles, from which dangled acrobats, gargoyles, unidentified artistic shapes. On the walls were clocks and dartboards, posters and plaques, paintings and etchings, but nothing that appealed to him. Nothing he knew would bring the delight into Billy's eyes he loved so much. "Help, gentlemen?" With typical to Rand Peltzer Oriental furtiveness, a tallow-faced Chinese woman had suddenly appeared from beneath the counter by simply process of standing up. Rand started, nearly dropping the brass ashtray he had picked up. "Yes," he said. "I'd like something for my son. Something different." The woman pointed to a stereo, then to a watch. Rand shook his head. "You like mechanical things?" the woman asked. "No, he's an artist. Cartoonist. Maybe you got some sort of gizmo an artist could use?" "Gizmo?" "Yeah," Rand replied with sudden inspiration. "Maybe something like a combination easel and brush holder, or..." His eyes drifted towards the ceiling as he began to feel his inspirational juices flowing. "Or maybe an easel you could fold up and carry in your pocket, for the artist who travels a lot." "Gizmo," the woman repeated, holding a rechargeable battery for Rand to see. He shook his head, starting for the door as he continued to ponder the problems of constructing a portable easel. "1 minute," the woman called out. Rand hesitated as she darted from behind the counter through a small door leading to the back room. No sooner was she gone than Rand became aware of another presence. "Mister wants something different?" asked the new voice. It belonged to a very thin Chinese boy. He had long legs, which made him appear taller and no doubt several years older than he really was, which Rand guessed to be about 9. He was dressed in a faded LA Dodgers jacket, a wrinkled Springsteen t-shirt, worn-out torn Levi's, and high-top sneakers, an outfit, Rand observed inwardly, that made him look like a walking advertisement for unclaimed freight auctions. Still, there was something about him that Rand liked and trusted. "That's right," he said, his glance alternating between his huge dark eyes at the kid and the doorway between which the woman had departed. Something unusual. Something nobody else has. Then realizing that such a description fit only a very few items, such as the Hope Diamond, he amended himself. I mean, it doesn't have to be expensive, or the only thing of its kind, but I like it to be, well, different, you know. The youngster nodded. Follow me, please, he said. Can't you just tell me what it is? No, sir. It defies description. Oh, Rand thought. So it defies description. Does it? If the kid had picked up the phrase at such a tender age, he must have been a truly precocious con artist. Perhaps he was the bait for a gang of muggers or kidnappers. Good sense warned Rand to give up on his quest as soon as possible. On the other hand, when had he ever listened to his own good sense? The old woman reappeared, dangling a huge inflatable, and now quite inflated red dragon, which would have filled all but the largest bathtubs. Ismo? He asked. No, Rand smiled, backing towards the exit. But thanks anyway. A moment later, he was on the street, a Chinese youngster at his elbow. Trinkets? The boy said disparagingly. You want something different, and she offers you trinkets. As a salesman, Rand had learned long ago never to knock another fellow's product. In time, his young man would learn the same lesson. He supposed, and now was an appropriate moment to give him this subtle bit of wisdom. That was a very nice dragon, he said. A lot of people might enjoy that. It just wasn't for me. A trinket, the kid repeated. A big trinket. Follow me, and you'll see something really different. Rand did so, although he cautioned himself to be warier than usual. The avenue was bustling with activity, but he scanned the passing faces with careful scrutiny to catch a nod or signal directed by or at the youngster. As they moved down the length of the block, he saw nothing unusual. Tradespeople passed quickly, each involved in his or her own thoughts. A couple of nuns, giggling nervously, rode by in a rickshaw. Several young men, who looked like college students, carried on a brief conversation with a young Oriental woman, trying desperately to match her world weariness with a coolness of their own. Soon they were standing next to a stairway leading into a cellar. Here, the youngster said. No wonder we have to drag in people off the street, Rand muttered, looking around carefully. Kid opened the door at the bottom of the stairwell, indicated that Rand should follow. Taking a deep breath, Rand did so. Inside, excuse me. Phew. Message retracted. Julie? Well, how dare ya? Inside, it was no shop of horrors, but neither was it the shop brimming with exciting items. The main source of illumination seemed to be hundreds of candles, which burned singly or in groups of every flat surface in the cluttered room. Above dangled the usual Oriental mobiles, the metal ones creating their jangling music as the tiny silvers touched one another. Rand examined a truly beautiful chess set with huge men carved to resemble Japanese warriors and peasants. For a moment, he thought Billy would appreciate the artistry of the set, perhaps even be able to use it as a model for some of his cartoon figures. Then he shrugged. The chess set simply didn't say, "Buy me." Turning to locate the youngster, he saw an old Chinese gentleman instead. He was seated on the sort of platform, puffing gently on a long pipe. Long gray whiskers adorned the lower portion of his face, and on his head was a black skull cap. Dressed in a flowing brown tunic, he seemed almost priestly, seated up high. Rand entertained that thought for only a moment, however. The man, for all his formality and the air of ethereal detachment, was simply another salesman like himself. Only their environments differed. This man sat in his shop all day while Rand patrolled the world outside. Having arrived at the conclusion, it was logical that Rand take the next step. Moving closer to the man, he opened his briefcase and pulled out a complex-looking object, approximately a foot long. "Excuse me, sir," he said. "Follow a young man here, and he told me you might be something truly different for me to see." The Chinese gentleman nodded slowly. "My grandson," he said in a surprisingly deep and resonant voice. The expression accompanying the two-word reply was a mixture of fondness and skepticism, confirming Rand's earlier notion that the kid was a precocious con artist. Never one to be discouraged, Rand had already decided to make his pitch. Looking around at the curio shop, which was cluttered with the usual array of frightening Oriental masks, ancient witchcraft tokens, rotting skulls, and dusty books on the occult, he made a sort of sweeping gesture. "Now, sir, if I may say something," he began, "this is a very nice shop. But what you could use, in addition to this wonderful inventory you already have, are some new and modern items, like this." He held up the object he'd taken from his briefcase. A formless thing, it resembled a tuning fork to which clung a smaller variety of contrivances, gadgets, and appendages. "Now, let's say you get on the train or bus for an important business appointment," Rand began. "No sooner are you seated than you realize you forgot to brush your teeth, and your mouth feels like the government's been using it to test deadly chemicals. Normally, you'd have to cause for alarm, but not if you got one of these, the Bathroom Buddy. It's my own invention, just another product from the inventing laboratory of Rand Peltzer, the man who makes the impossible possible with the illogical logical." Ignoring the Chinese gentleman's total lack of interest, Rand slid one arm from the side of the object, producing a sort of crude toothbrush. Then he pushed a button, which in turn caused a spray of watery white paste to spurt out so hard it hit the nearby wall, then dribbled slowly onto the floor. "No problem," Rand said, pushing the off switch. The device continued to spew off white gunk down the length of the object and into the palm of Rand's hand, burbling thickly as it did so. "No problem," Rand repeated. "Cleans up easily. And when it works, it's just one of 10 highly useful parts of the Bathroom Buddy. Of course, I'm prejudiced, but I think you could use a few modern gadgets like this in your shop. How about I put you down for a dozen? Believe me, even in a place like this, which isn't exactly Sears Roebuck's, they'd be gone in a week." As if to punctuate Rand's climactic promise, the Bathroom Buddy emitted a loud single noise, something between a belch and an explosion of wet cement, sending forth a thick geyser of gluey glop that eventually came to rest on the inventor's left lapel. "Still has a few bugs in it," Rand said weakly. The Chinese man broke then, like Mount Rushmore suddenly coming to life. The lips parted, revealing a set of impressively huge teeth, and gales of laughter began to shake him. First he undulated sideways, then up and down. A trembling finger emerged from beneath the tunic, and finally honed in on Rand, an accusing crook that bounced lightly as the old man shook with laughter. "Tee-hee-hee, Thomas Edison," he giggled. "Thomas Edison." Embarrassed, but inured by the experience, by past mishaps, Rand chuckled good-naturedly, especially when he noticed that the young shill had witnessed the demonstration and was also laughing. For a moment, Rand merely faked his own laugh, waiting patiently for the moment of derision to end, and he did so. However, he became aware of a third voice in the choir of laughter. It was higher than those of the old man and boy, rather unearthly, a cross between a gurgle of an infant and a shriek of a parrot. "Wait," he called out. "What's that?" Took a moment for the old man and boy to contain themselves. When they did so, their sudden silence isolated the alien voice, emphasizing its strange intonation as it continued to giggle in the background. "I've never heard anything like that," Rand muttered. Looking from one Oriental to the other, they responded to his implied question with evasive expressions. The old man seemed to have developed a sudden fascination with a piece of paper on his desk. The boy, less subtle, merely turned away. Meanwhile, the bizarre laughter continued to echo from the small room just behind them.
Boy, that must be something.
Rand said to one in particular, moving toward the doorway of the room. As he reached the entrance, he turned to look at the youngster.
Is that it?
He asked.
Is that the reason you brought me here? Is that the different thing?
The boy looked at the floor, intimidated by the sharp glance from his grandfather.
Yeah, I guess it must be,
Rand replied to his own question.
I'd sure like to see who or what owns that laugh.
Hesitating at the doorway, he paused as a sense of propriety gripped him. The back room, after all, was private, and regardless of the curiosity he felt, it necessary to have their permission to look there. In response, the old Chinese gentleman shrugged.
Thanks,
Rand said. Pushing his way through the set of beaded curtains, he entered the inner sanctum, waiting a moment for his eyes to adjust to the darkness. Finally, he was able to make out a table on which several dozen shoeboxes, each containing bits of assorted trinkets, were piled. Near them was a small box about a foot square, draped with a piece of burlap. From behind the burlap came soft sounds. No longer the high-pitched, gleeful giggle of a minute previously, but something unearthly nonetheless. Moving to the edge of the table, he reached forward, now aware that the two Orientals had followed him and were standing at the doorway, their fingers casting elongated shadows into the room. Gently, almost reverentially, Rand lifted the burlap curtain. Wow, he said softly. He had never seen a creature like it before.
What in the world is this?
Rand asked.
Mogwai, the old Chinese man replied.
Mog what?
It's what he calls himself. It took me a while to find out. I no idea what it means.
Mogwai, Rand repeated. Sounds like something from another planet. Too hard to remember and pronounce. As far as I'm concerned, you're just playing Gizmo.
The creature looked balefully at Rand. A low sound emitted from its closed mouth.
What's he doing?
Rand asked.
Singing,
the Chinese youngster replied.
He only does that for people he likes.
Rand smiled.
What's he eat?
He asked. The old man returned the smile.
Anything.
What do you mean, anything?
Anything that can be chewed. Yesterday, he ate a rubber washer. He's also eaten cardboard and packing chips, but I think he most enjoys the things we like.
Candy? Rand asked, suddenly remembered that he had a Milky Way bar in his jacket pocket.
Oh, definitely,
the Chinese man's replied. Rand found the bar and unwrapped it. Pushing it gently into the cage, he watched intently as the creature sniffed it and devoured the soft mixture of chocolate and caramel in 3 or 4 large bites. Delighted, Rand found himself applauding. Swallowing heavily, the Mogwai seemed to return a glance that said,
Thank you.
How much do you want for it? Rand asked.
Mogwai is not for sale,
the old man replied.
Oh, come on,
Rand persisted.
My son'd love it, and we'd love to give it a home.
I am sorry.
Listen, I gotta have it. This is what your grandson brought me to see, isn't it?
No, I send him out to interest customers in other items of my shop, but not Mogwai.
But that's the only stuff that's different. The rest is just curio stuff. The standard souvenirs and...
Trinkets?
The young man interjected.
Not exactly,
Rand added, seeing a pained look in the old man's eyes.
You got a nice place. That chess set out there is wonderful. My boy doesn't play chess, though. This here gizmo is perfect. I'll give you $100.
Thank you. No.
Rand removed his wallet, hoping that the sight of the money itself would change the man's mind, or at least make him realize how serious he was. Fingering a couple of 50s, Rand added another, then another. The old man continued to shake his head.
250,
Rand said, spreading the bills across the palm of his hand like a poker player displaying a royal flush. Take it, please. The old man withdrew his eyes from the money. Revulsion and desire blended in his features. A dieter confronted with a juicy meal that he wants and does not want. $260, Rand persisted. It's all I've got.
Take it, Grandpop,
The young man urged.
No. We need the money. The rent.
No, the old man repeated.
Mogwai is not like other animals. He is a very special creature. With Mogwai comes much responsibility.
Hey, I'm a responsible person, Rand interjected. I go to church every Sunday. Well, a lot of Sundays. I pay my taxes, take the garbage out. What's wrong with me?
It's not you. It is humanity. I'm sorry, but I cannot sell Mogwai at any price.
With that, the old man turned and left the room. Rand sighed, slowly pushed the money back into his wallet, noting that the young man continued to eye the bills wistfully. You can't reason with them? He asked. The young man took a deep breath, walked slowly to the doorway, and looked out at his grandfather, who was now seated near the front of the store, staring stoically at the passerby. Returning to Rand, he looked at him in a manner of an employer assessing someone applying for a job.
Listen, mister, he said. The old man's right. This is a very special creature. The person who has him has to be extra careful. Do some strange sounding things.
Like what?
Well, there are rules, you see. You gotta keep him out of sight, out of the light. That's why it's so dark in here. He hates light, especially bright light.
Okay, I think I can handle that. You have a nice dark basement and Billy's room.
And don't get him wet. Keep him away from the water.
No light, no water. I guess a day at the beach is out of the question. Kid looked at Rand pointedly.
I'm serious, mister, he said.
Sure, Rand replied. It's just that animals need water to drink, right?
This one doesn't.
You sure? The youngster nodded emphatically.
I'm telling you, he said. Light may kill him, and water may kill you.
What?
That's what my grandfather says. Don't ask me how he knows, but those are two important rules. If you don't think you can do that, say so. It's only because we need the money. So bad that I'm even thinking about selling you Mogwai.
Sure, I understand, Rand nodded, reaching for his wallet again.
I almost forgot. The most important thing, the boy continued. The thing you can never forget is, no matter how much he cries, no matter how much he begs, never, ever feed him after midnight. You got it?
Rand swallowed, forcing back a sudden impulse to laugh at such a quaint set of rules. Maybe the old man was senile, and the kid just plain crazy, but his heart was set on bringing that little animal home to Billy. That meant playing the game with this kid, he'd do it. I got it, he said seriously. No light, no water, no food after midnight. He started to hand the money to the boy, then thought better of it. Where'll I meet you? He asked.
Out back, in 5 minutes.
Rand nodded. Whistling softly, he stole another look at Gizmo and then walked briskly out of the curio shop.
Whew.
Yeah, that bitch Deagle.
My voice is a little bit like, today.
Trying extra hard to do these voices extra good for you. Also, wearing this really cool Dead Spaceman shirt that Ellery got me. Wonderful wife. Black milk for men. We out here. We out here. Rocking the black milk. Small gizmo. It hurt.
Yeah, you can kind of see. Yeah, that's fun. Boom. Gizmo hanging out. Chapter 4. Let's see. Fun stuff. More fun stuff from you, my friends. More fun stuff for you, my friends. Chapter 4. It was 8:54, 6 minutes before the bank opened for business, when Billy pushed through the employees-only door and began the ridiculous task of trying to look unobtrusive while arriving a quarter hour late with a wet dog in tow. Lucky was with him. Yep. She will make me a man sharky, and they can go on a male model for them. Poses like this. All right, let's continue with the book. Luck was with him briefly. Tugging gently at Barney's collar, he managed to make it to his window, locate the leash he kept in his drawer, and secure Barney out of the way without breaking into a barking fit. Whipping out his nameplate, he placed it upside down on the counter, brushed a bead of sweat from the corner of his eye, and exhaled wearily. Only then did he see the object that usually looked for first when he entered the bank. Today she was dressed in blue, a form-fitting but conservative dress that complemented her flashy green eyes and dazzling dark hair. Billy, like so many other young men, and older men too for that matter, had fallen madly and totally in love with Kate Barringer the first time he laid eyes on her. She was 20, a perhaps too intense woman of that age, a champion of the underdog. Considering himself an underdog, that suited Billy just fine. Of course, but so far he found that Kate pleasant, was somewhat unapproachable. Perhaps it was because she was so smart, never at a loss for words, that he feared being shot down by her should he move too quickly. And so he moved nearly imperceptibly. By the end of the century, he once said to himself, as he analyzed his longing for her as what to do about it, by then I'll have asked her for a date. As he began to arrange his money drawer, he noticed Kate moving toward him. Arriving at his window, she reached out to turn his nameplate right side up, smiling briefly as she did so. Morning, Kate, Billy said. Now, with her so close, he could smell her scrubbed freshness, see the fine hairs on her arm as it tapered to a beautifully slim wrist. Billy, she said, her voice warm, not intimate. Will you sign a petition? Sure, he said. He reached for a pen. Don't you want to know what it's for? She asked, with a touch of pique. Not really, he replied. If you think it's a good idea, it's okay by me. It was the wrong thing to say. I'd like you to agree with me that it's a good idea, she said archly. And there's no way you can do that unless you know what the petition's for. Billy nodded. What's it for? We're trying to have Dory's pub declared a landmark. Why? Mrs. Deagle threatened to close it when the lease expires later this month. She's threatening to close down everything when their leases expire. That was Billy. She's threatening to close down everything when their leases expire, Billy murmured. She told my dad the same thing. Of course,
He forgets to make payments every once in a while. What's Dory's problem? It's another of Mrs. Deagle's personal vendettas, Kate replied. She said Dory's a dive, an eyesore, bad influence on the neighborhood. But that's where my dad proposed to my mom, Billy said ingenuously. That's where everybody's dad proposed to their mom, or vice versa. Billy smiled, fantasizing that he might propose to Kate in the same place. His courage aided somewhat by the notion, he said, That's a beautiful dress. You look very pretty today. Not that you don't look pretty every day. Kate smiled, flattered but anxious that Billy signed before Gerald Hopkins got to the window and started asking questions. She thrust the petition beneath Billy's pen and watched as he wrote his name. A moment later, Gerald Hopkins was at their side. What's going on? He asked. At 23, Hopkins was already fast approaching middle age. Gerald's mind, in fact, seemed to have attained that goal and only awaited his body to catch up. The bank's junior vice president, he was tall, slender, and good-looking in a somewhat sneaky way. Perhaps because he smiled too quickly and his eyes darted nervously from side to side, those were things that gave him away. He laid bare his ambition to become an important man in as short a time as possible. Young people, most of them at any rate, distrusted Gerald, but did not bother him as long as Mr. Corbin and other grown-ups continued to compliment him on his efficiency, drive, and initiative. They, after all, were the ones who made the decisions. Kate, ignoring Gerald's question, started to her window. For a moment, it seemed that Gerald was about to follow. Then he turned abruptly to Billy. Mr. Corbin and I want to see you, he said. Billy shrugged, walked slowly behind Gerald into the sumptuous and very formal office of Roland Corbin. Around the walls of the oak-paneled rooms were portraits of every United States president, Generals George Patton, Omar Bradley, William Tecumseh Sherman, John Pershing, and looking decidedly underdressed in a toga and a bit embarrassed, Julius Caesar. Hey, careful, Fury. Beneath this panorama of greatness were bookcases, each locked and filled with soporific-looking, legal, identically bound books, except for a long bottom row filled with the complete works of Horatio Alger, Jr. Every time he was summoned into Mr. Corbin's vault, as Katie termed it, Billy's eyes fell on the end Alger volume, which was entitled Luck and Pluck. He wondered if Mr. Corbin had read it as a boy. Perhaps Gerald Hopkins had read it only a few weeks ago. Seated judge-like behind his mammoth desk, a gold nameplate in front proclaiming his identity was Roland Corbin in a perfect-fitting three-piece gray suit. In his early 60s, he was the epitome of the world distinguished. His neatly trimmed white hair framing a face that was lightly tanned and only slightly wrinkled. If he smiled, Mr. Corbin might have been almost handsome. As it was, he usually frowned, a movement that collapsed and pinched his features like someone pulling the drawstring on a leather pouch. His habit of putting his thumbs and fingers together to form a sort of prayerful tent had become a trademark of both him and his protege Gerald. 17 minutes and 33 seconds, Corbin said now. 17. Said in ex cathedra tones.
That's how late you were, William.
I'm sorry, Billy stammered. Punctuality.
Punctuality is the politeness of kings, Corbin said fatuously. Do you know who said that?
Billy hesitated. For a fleeting moment, he was tempted to suggest that the dull aphorism was coined by Gerald Hopkins, but then he thought better of it. No sense making a bad situation worse. Instead, he shook his head. It was Benjamin Franklin, Gerald interjected.
Louis the 18th, Corbin corrected.
Intimidating.
Gerald in the baleful glare. Returning his attention to Billy, he added, "If King Louis the 18th could be on time, so can you."
Yes, sir, Billy said. Except that King Louis never had a temperamental Volkswagen.
Gerald snorted derisively.
We didn't call you in here to listen to excuses, Peltzer, Gerald said. Your job carries a lot of responsibilities. One of them is to be here on time.
Well said, Gerald, Corbin nodded, obviously impressed with young Hopkins' didactic tone.
Thanks, Mr. Corbin, Gerald smiled.
Straighten your tie, Gerald shot back.
Yes, sir.
He did so. Corbin watched him briefly before directing his glare once again at Billy. See that this doesn't happen again, he said. If your car's temperamental, get a new car, or leave earlier so you'll be prepared for problems. Billy nodded enthusiastically, just as Mr. Corbin had come up with a miraculous solution to his dilemma. Then, as he turned to leave, he heard Corbin harumph. Yes, sir, he asked. Your shoes, William, Mr. Corbin growled. They're brown. Billy looked down, nodded once again. No doubt about it, his shoes were indeed brown. No one wears brown shoes with dark blue trousers, Corbin intoned.
Oh, thanks. I'll remember next time, Billy replied, as respectful as possible. He was allowed to slink out then, but his troubles were only just beginning. The doors of the bank, having been opened to the public during his trial and conviction, there were perhaps a dozen customers in the process of doing business, most of them withdrawing money for Christmas purchases. One of the group was Mrs. Deagle, who, in pushing her way to the front of the line, suddenly found herself next to Mrs. Harris. Harris, a genial middle-aged woman who was known to have bad year in both who have had a bad year in that both she and her husband had lost their jobs and had medical problems. She seemed almost jovial today, however, as she tugged at Mrs. Deagle's coat sleeve. Mrs. Deagle, said, in a voice loud enough to get overheard by Billy, my husband's got another job. Oh? Mrs. Deagle replied sharply. What's that supposed to mean? It means we'll be able to make a few payments back as soon as Christmas is over. What's Christmas got to do with it? Well, there's presents to buy, you know? And in the meantime, wait, is that it? No, not exactly. I just thought that since things were... Oh. And in the meantime, I wait. Is that it? No, not exactly. I just thought that since things were looking up for us, you might be willing to wait a little longer. Mrs. Harris, the old woman said, this bank and I have the same purpose in life, to make money. Why should we have to wait around until you decide to pay your legal obligations? Mrs. Harris frowned. But we don't have the spare cash now. It's Christmas. Then you know what to ask Santa for, Mrs. Deagle replied, dismissing her with a wave of her hand. She moved towards Billy's window, the bodies parting in front of her like the Red Sea obeying Moses. Under her arm she carried the severed head of the ceramic snowman, which, seen up close, looked tacky and ugly. Yellowed and pockmarked from the weather, the object's mouth hung open and would seem more a crazed stare than a happy smile. Hello, Miss Deagle, Billy stammered. What can I do for you today? You mean, in addition to what you've already done? She announced grandly. I'm sorry, Billy said. I don't understand. This is what's left of my imported ceramic snowman, she nearly shouted. Your dog broke it this morning. Billy had no recollection of the incident, but was it too decided a disadvantage to protest. Gee, I'm really sorry, he said. Just tell me what I owe you. To his surprise, she replied, I don't want money. That's a switch. That's the switch. A phantom voice to Billy's right whispered. It was Kate, looking straight ahead at her own customer, but totally enmeshed in Billy's dilemma. I heard that, young lady, Mrs. Deagle rasped, glaring at Kate. You'd better watch out. I'm on to you. Scheming and plotting behind my back. Suddenly, her accusations seemed to include everyone within earshot. I know what's going on, what you think, what you'd like to see happen. But it'll never work, because I'm one step ahead of all of you. Kate, returning Mrs. Deagle's glare, waited patiently until the woman looked back to Billy. Now then, she said, since you've admitted your guilt in breaking this, and before a bank full of witnesses, what do you propose to do? I don't know, Mrs. Deagle, Billy muttered. I mean, if you don't want money, what can I do? Do you want me to clean up your yard, or... With an angry gesture, she cut him off. I want your dog, she said. Barney? Such a stupid name. Yes, the ugly mongrel that follows you around. I want him. But why? Billy asked. Because he's a menace to this town, and I aim to see that he's punished. An evil smile broke across Mrs. Deagle's face, revealing her singularly unattractive teeth. Excess lipstick clinging to her teeth made it seem as if she had just finished a bloody meal. Yes, I'd like to punish him, she said. Do you know that in the old days they used to put evil animals on trial and punish them? They hung an elephant once by his neck until he was dead. Guess who the star witness against it was, Kate whispered, her voice discreetly lowered this time, so the content of it was only heard by Billy. Stifling a laugh, she looked directly at Mrs. Deagle. I'm sorry you feel he's a menace, he said. I don't see how you can say that. He snapped at the Hagen boy and my nephew Douglas. They were trying to burn off his tail with a propane torch, Billy said, causing a ripple of laughter from the customers nearest the arena of battle. Mrs. Deagle dismissed Billy's defense with a wave. He's always barking and growling at my cats, scaring them half to death. Well, cats and dogs just don't get along so well, Billy replied. You've seen the cartoons. I hate cartoons. Billy looked away, suddenly conscious that he was facing a double jeopardy now. Having heard his name, Barney had arisen from his sleeping position, was now trying to jump onto Billy's lap. The leash, fastened not too tightly around his neck, was slowly coming loose as Barney tugged at it. The rasping sound of his claws against the bank's polished wood floor caused Billy to break into a cold sweat. Why didn't the old woman leave him alone? Why did this normally obedient dog pick this time to get playful? Pushing gently at Barney not only did no good, it made Mrs. Deagle think he was preoccupied with something on his lap, which inflamed her to new outreaches of anger. Pay attention, she shouted. I'm telling you, I want that dog. I'll take him to a kennel. There he'll be put to sleep. It'll be quick and painless compared to what I like to do. What a fucking demon! More to distract her from Barney's restless maneuvering beneath his chair than to find out, Billy asked, What would you like to do, Mrs. Deagle? More to distract her from Barney. Oh. Her response was immediately, I'd like to say, Here, Barney, she began. Come here, nice Barney, so I can strangle you with my own bare hands. It was over in a split second. Freeing his neck suddenly from the leash, Barney hurled himself onto the edge of Billy's chair and toward the sound of his name. With only a brief bounce on the countertop, his next destination was Mrs. Deagle's shoulders, on which he came to rest with both floppy and slightly wet feet. Face to face with her enemy, Mrs. Deagle shrieked and dropped the ceramic head, which promptly shattered into 1,000 bits and splinters. Barney took the occasion to lick her face, starting at the cleft of her chin and continuing until his tongue became enmeshed in the wiry dankness of her auburn hair. He then started to gag, the first violent heaves throwing him and Mrs. Deagle onto the bank floor in a tangle of arms, legs, and paws. "Help! Help!" she screamed. Instantly, the twin figures of Gerald Hopkins and Mr. Corbin appeared, each bumping the other in his eagerness to assist the bank's greatest benefactor to her feet. "William!" Mr. Corbin shouted accusingly. "What is this dog doing here?" "He followed me, Mr. Corbin," Billy replied weakly. "I couldn't help it, and there was no time to take him home, because I was already late." Pouncer, this is a bank, not a pet store," Gerald offered. Mr. Corbin nodded agreement, then turned his attention to the disheveled Mrs. Deagle, who stood adjusting her hair and trying not to look undignified. "My dear lady," he murmured solicitously, "are you all right?" Taking the cue, Mrs. Deagle placed a fluttering hand over her titty. Rest. "My heart!" she whined. "I can't take this kind of shock. I'm not supposed to have any excitement." Billy looked at Kate. Her expression, which she read perfectly, seemed to say, "Well, if you're not supposed to have excitement, why do you run around causing trouble?" "Barney wouldn't have hurt you, Mrs. Deagle," he began. "Lies and excuses," she shot back. "You're just like your father. I've been listening to his excuses for months. How he forgot to make a payment. He's a loser, a crackpot, and a loser. You hear that?" Billy shook his head, started to protest, but Mr. Corbin intervened. "Please, Mrs. Deagle," he soothed. "You said yourself you're not supposed to have any excitement." "I can tell him that I think he's no good father and no good dog. That's not excitement. It's a public duty." Gerald laughed appreciatively. I'll get that mangy beast," Mrs. Deagle continued, the blue veins in her neck staring out starkly against the powder-bleached paleness of her throat. "Someday, when you least expect it, I'll get even." Barney, not comprehending the threat in the least, wagged his tail in response. "Good boy, Barney." With one final hateful glance at the entire group, Mrs. Deagle propelled herself out of the bank. "If I ever see that dog in the bank again, you're fired," Mr. Corbin said, turning on his heel and heading for his office. "Yes, sir," Billy nodded. Gerald Hopkins shrugged and smiled scornfully. "I hope he's bank broken," he snickered. "If not, your time may be here sooner than you think." As Billy started back towards his window, he reflected darkly on the fortunes of the day. The downward spiral continued at the same rate. By evening, he would be in a degree of trouble experienced by few mortal men. A lot of action in that chapter right there. Woof. Shit, bruh. You know. My voice is getting a little bit today. We're having fun. This is a good one. This is fun. Love all the backstory. I think that's actually pretty sweet. Helps open up the lore a little bit. Helps it, us to know a little bit more about the Gremlin. They were manufactured and, just happen to be okay at Earth. They're decent at Earth. Ho, 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 ho. Chapter 5. The Mogwai, nearly asleep only minutes after finishing the delicious candy bar given him by the mysterious burly stranger. Excuse me. The Mogwai, nearly asleep only minutes after finishing the delicious candy bar given him by the mysterious burly stranger, thought at first that the disoriented feeling was part of the prelude to the dreamland he often experienced following a hearty meal. The box was moving so slowly, so subtly, he barely noticed it. When he heard the voices, soft and sibilant, as if the speakers were making a conscious effort to be quiet. Accompanying those symptoms were a rise in unfamiliar background noise and a sudden change in temperature. A cry of terror caught in his throat and then burst forth. He was being moved. Now the voices outside the box spoke quickly, as if panicked, and the movements of the Mogwai's tiny home were quick and jolting. All pretense at secrecy having been abandoned. Tossed back and forth in the box, the victim of some terrible upheaval, he tried to cry out to the Chinese man. Again and again, he tried to form and pronounce the words of the strange language he had heard so often. Because of problems built into his species by Mogterman, he was unable to emit more than a shriek of gibberish. Called out. Just when he began to think his body was about to shatter from the turbulences and dizziness he was experiencing, the box came to rest. The floor was at a slant, but at least the earthquake was over. Two loud metallic slams, a grinding sound, and an engine roar followed. Then a gentle, continuous rocking. It would have been comforting had he not been utterly terrified. The tears came a few minutes later, when he faced the probability that he would never see his Chinese man again. "Don't worry, Gizmo," a deep, soft voice soothed. "It's gonna be all right." The edge of the burlap was lifted from the outside, emitting the sudden flash of a neon sign through the openings in the box. The Mogwai screamed, threw his hands to cover his eyes. Abruptly the burlap fell, and the voice said, "Sorry, old buddy. I didn't realize. I guess what he said was true. But don't worry, I'll be careful. We all will." It happened again. He knew it would. Of course, since by Earth life standards he was virtually immortal. These beings lived such brief lives. Why couldn't they hang on longer, so that there would be less upheaval in his existence? He had been with the Chinese gentleman nearly 40 Earth years, had seen him bend from the healthy and strong young man into a frail specter of his former self. Fortunately, the man's mind remained active and alert. They understood each other. The Chinese man knew the rules, even a few words of the Mogwai's language, and seemed to sense much more. These transferals always threw him in such a fit of depression. He tried not to think of the numerous times he had barely escaped death because his owner knew nothing at all about his needs, or, knowing his needs, simply didn't care to see that they were provided for. Even worse were those who discovered his powers, and how was it possible these humans could be so dense, actually used him as a source of amusement? They were amused only briefly before having to face the ultimate terror of that little solace to him. He merely wanted an enlightened caretaker, someone who understood or was as responsible as the old gentleman. This burly man who was now transporting him, heaven knows where, did not seem exactly responsible for the Mogwai. For one thing, he kept calling him Gizmo over and over, as if trying to have him accept his name or description. Yet the man knew him was Mogwai. The Chinese man had told him so. Was it the first harsh reality of his new situation that he'd have to be called Gizmo? It sounded truly terrible. There were worse things, of course. Thinking back as they bumped gently along, he remembered the China Sea, crossing just before he had encountered his owner friend of nearly 40 years. They had gotten loose then. There had been no way to prevent it. He shuddered. What could have happened had he not been rescued by the Chinese man just a few minutes before the ship was torpedoed? Before that was the incident at the Royal Air Force Base. Incident? A near tragedy of epic proportions. Somehow, an extended joke had been made of things, but Mogwai knew differently. What would he do if it had happened again? Probably nothing very much, as had been the case in the past, because there was largely powerless to act once it started. That's why the Chinese gentleman had been such an exemplary guardian. Without being told, he seemed to know how important prevention was. Even better, he realized that Mogwai did not mind strictures or avenues of freedom being closed off. That's why the past decades have been comparatively hazard-free. The Chinese man had enough responsibility for both of them. Gizmo, 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 my friend, the burly man sing-songed above the song of the car. You and me and Millie, we're going to have a terrific time together. Gizmo. Yes, his Mogwai adoptability had already made him accept his new aim. Sighed, pulled his great umbrella-like ears over his face, and tried to sleep. A new life was beginning for him, and he just didn't want to think about it. Wow, this extra bit with seen through the sides of Gizmo, through the lens of Gizmo, very cute. A little bit. Gizmo is just a slick little motherfucker. All right, I think let's get him for Christmas, and then I think we're gonna call it a day. My throat is. Chapter 6. Somehow Billy got through the rest of the workday, the worst part of which was the succession of triumphant leers from Gerald Hopkins every time their paths crossed. Barney fell asleep under the counter and was good as gold until lunchtime, when Billy took him home. Mr. Corbin went to a luncheon given by the Tri-County Businessmen's Association and didn't return until nearly 4 o'clock. He seemed to have forgotten the incident involving Barney and Mrs. Deagle. Kate, as beautiful as ever, was Billy's only continuing source of visual, and he contemplated asking her for a date soon. Mental pleasure. By closing, he was in a better frame of mind, although he did not relish the idea of walking everywhere until his car decided to let him rejoin the human race. On the other hand, walking at Christmas time was unpleasant in that the town was colorfully decorated and most people seemed in happy moods. Kingston Falls Main Square was lined with lights when Billy closed the bank door behind him and started home. His plan was to mosey along, looking in store windows in the hope he would see something different and interesting from Mom or Dad. In recent years, they had become tough cases. As far as Christmas shopping went, Mom claimed that she needed nothing, but she was always delighted when package opening time came. Dad, of course, either had everything or was in the process of inventing it. He enjoyed the thought behind a nice present, though. Crossing to the town square, Billy walked among the rows of Christmas trees, occupying their fresh pine smell. His mind still preoccupied with the day's turbulent events. He was the perfect target for Pete Fontaine's joke. Dressed as a Christmas tree, complete with blinking lights, dangling ornaments, and silver tinsel, 13-year-old Pete stood perfectly still next to the other trees until Billy was inches away, then reached out and grabbed his arm. Billy jumped.
Hey, Billy!
Pete laughed.
Got you, huh?
Billy left.
Yeah. Guess I was thinking about something else.
He regarded Pete from head to toe.
How's business? He asked. Don't ask me.
Pete shrugged.
Pop sells them, and I just act like one.
As they strolled along the edge of the tree-lined square, Pete dutifully recited his pitch whenever they approached a potential buyer.
Christmas trees, get 'em here.
He called out.
All sizes and shapes, get one just like me.
As the frozen-featured man walked quickly by, Pete added,
Hey there, sir. Bet you could use a Christmas tree, huh?
The man, staring at the ground, ignored him.
Bet he's got an aluminum one.
Pete said in a loud voice.
Or he puts lights on his cat.
Billy smiled briefly until the cat reference made him think of Mrs. Deagle and the threat to destroy Barney. Was it possible her life was so bitter she would actually consider doing such a thing? Pete's father, an exact replica of him with 30 years added on, gestured to his son.
Help Mr. Anderson load this into a station wagon, he said.
Billy grabbed the tall tree with Pete. Child grabbed with Pete, went to the car. Mr. Anderson, an elderly gentleman, opened the back, and they placed the tree inside.
Thanks, Billy,
Pete said. A psychologist, looking at Pete's eyes and listening to the tone of his voice, would have known instantly that young Pete was expressing gratitude for more than the tree errand. Now, at the pimply-faced, gawky, and totally insecure stage, and filled with conviction that no one really liked him, least of all older teens, Pete's admiration of Billy verged on hero worship. He was the older kid who actually treated Pete like a human being. Not that his father was unkind to him, nor that he picked on by his contemporaries. They merely treated him like something that was just there. Billy, on the other hand, seemed interested in him. If he wanted to, Pete felt he could tell him a personal problem, ask his advice, and not be regarded as either a jerk or a potential social offender. Now, with business a bit slow and Billy at hand, Pete decided the time was right.
Hey, Billy,
He said,
you're pretty old.
That's right. Billy smiled. I get my first retirement check next week.
I mean, you've got tons of experience, right?
Experience with what?
Well, with girls.
Sure.
You ever ask a girl out?
Sure, that's usually the best way to go out with them, to ask.
Yeah.
Pete murmured.
How did you do it? I mean, what did you say?
Billy shrugged.
It depends on the girl and the situation,
He said, trying to sound worldly but not blasé.
You gotta be firm, confident. Make it sound like you're doing her a favor by asking her out. Really?
Pete's eyes were bright and wide with his new piece of knowledge.
Sure. You can't get all gushy and nervous.
Never let her know how much you really like her.
I get it. Maybe you should zap her with a few insults first.
Billy laughed.
That may be carrying it a bit too far. You got somebody in mind? No, not really.
Pete lied. Then amending himself, he said,
Well, maybe there's somebody.
Billy laughed. He reached out, trying to find a place near Pete's shoulder to pat without getting jabbed by pine needles.
Let me know how it turns out,
he said.
Yeah,
Pete answered, waving as Billy stepped off the curb and headed down the block. Billy smiled, recalling their conversation as he walked. Why didn't life get easier? Pete, he was a wise and cool young man, capable of dealing with life in general and women in particular. To himself, he was hardly more proficient than at 13. Words still got twisted in his mouth, and thoughts muddled in his brain before he could articulate them. And yet the very notion that Pete considered him worldly and wise buoyed his spirits to the point where he decided to drop into Dory's pub. It was unlikely that Kate would be there yet. She usually went home to change before reporting for work, even if she didn't arrive before Billy finished a mug of beer. However, he considered it important to take the initial plunge of going inside. Once or twice in the past he'd done so, but had emerged in a depressed mood after seeing the attention lavished
upon Kate by the older men at the bar. Not that she returned their overtures. She was friendly, even joked with them, but was never intimate. That should have pleased Billy. Instead, he concluded unhappily that if she rejected those sharp-tongued, sophisticated, successful men, what chance did he have? Tonight he was determined to brave his own insecurity. Going inside, he stood at the entrance foyer, waiting for his eyes to adjust to the darkness, laid out as an old-fashioned Irish pub. Dory's was dimly lit, with small wooden tables and sawdust on the floor. The long bar was already crowded with young and middle-aged men, as well as a scattering of women. In the corner, a pair of video games colorfully and noisily zapped aliens or threatened players' electronic heroes with instant fragmentation. Locating an empty table, Billy sat down, ordered a beer, and none other than sandy-haired Dory Dougal himself, the genuine Irishman who operated the pub. 10 minutes later, beginning to feel relaxed, he took out the drawing pad he always carried with him and began to sketch. Soon the lines evolved into recognizable form. A muscular warrior battling a giant, horrifying dragon with a face too similar to Mrs. Deagle's to be mere coincidence. In the process, the warrior is defending a young princess with an uncanny resemblance to Kate Barringer. Despite the bad lighting, Billy was pleased with the result he had gotten and was admiring the effect when a sudden shadow falling across the picture brought him back to reality.
Terrific, a sardonic voice said. The world needs more unemployed artists.
It was Gerald Hopkins. In deference to its being after hours, he unfastened the 2 buttons on his 3-button suit and loosened his tie slightly. Without being invited, he dropped into the chair opposite Billy and smiled in a superior manner.
Speaking of unemployment, guess who almost applied for it today?
I give up, Billy said coolly.
You! Taking a long beat.
Taking a long beat so it could sink in. He then continued.
Mr. Corbin had second thoughts, though. He gets all sentimental about the holidays.
Imagine that.
Yeah,
Gerald sneered.
I would have fired you in a second.
Merry Christmas to you, too, Billy deadpanned.
You think it's mean of me to even think about firing somebody, right?
Gerald demanded.
Well, let me tell you something. It's a tough world out there. To get ahead, you have to be tougher. That's why I'm junior vice president at age 23. In 2 or 3 years, I'll have Mr. Corbin's job. And then when I'm 30, I'll be a millionaire. When you're 30, you'll probably only be 28.
Billy shrugged.
Well, you have my blessing, Jer, said evenly.
Don't call me that. My name's Gerald.
Sure, Jer.
At that moment, Kate passed nearby with a tray and drinks, wearing an apron on the Dory's pub was emblazoned in large green letters. Gerald spun his head and snapped his fingers in her direction. With a tight smile, she moved to the table.
I'll have an Irish coffee,
Gerald ordered.
But don't pour the Irish whiskey in the coffee. Bring it in a separate glass, and I'll do it.
Kate nodded, looking at Billy.
You all right?
She asked.
Fine,
said. Glancing at the drawing in his lap, she turned her head sideways and smiled.
Do I sense some hostility there?
She murmured slyly.
Hostility, but no talent.
I think it's good,
Kate said.
Then you're still into comic books,
Gerald sneered. Billy, somewhat embarrassed by Kate's praise and intimidated by Hopkins' arrogance, tried to change the subject. He succeeded only in blurting an obvious statement that Gerald gleefully pounced on. I guess you're working tonight? He said to Kate.
No, dummy, Gerald interjected. She's modeling aprons.
Every weeknight,
Kate said, ignoring him.
So Dory won't have to pay an extra waitress.
No pay, Gerald said. You work for free?
Suppose everybody did that. It's ridiculous. Maybe there's a young mother out there who could use the money.
Dory's got to save as much money as he can, or Mrs. Deagle will soon close this place down pretty soon, so everybody's pitching in to help. It's not a matter of keeping the paying job from someone else. This place closes down, a lot of jobs will go. I think it's great, Billy said.
It's dumb, economically, Gerald muttered. If a business can't make it without help from charity, it deserves to go under.
I'll get your Irish coffee, Kate said, turning to leave.
Wait a minute, Gerald said in a softer tone. You don't have to get all bent out of shape because I'm practical. Actually, it's a very nice thing you're doing.
Thank you,
Kate replied.
Gerald reached out to touch her arm.
Hey, Kate,
He said,
you haven't seen my new apartment.
I haven't seen your old apartment, she countered.
That's right, he retorted. The lights were out.
Seeing the fire in her eyes, Gerald laughed elaborately.
Just kidding, he said. But why don't we have dinner tomorrow night? Just the two of us.
I'd love to, but I've got to work.
Tell Dory you're sick. He won't be able to dock you.
Kate smiled mirthlessly, shook her head no, and left. Gerald watched her with smoldering, lustful eyes. Then he looked at Billy in a conspiratorial manner.
You think she's got something going with Dory? He asked.
Dory? Billy laughed. He's in his 40s. Maybe old enough to be her grandfather.
Why else would she work for free?
You ever hear of Christmas spirit? Billy challenged.
Only the kind that comes in a bottle,
Gerald smiled. I'm sorry for you.
Don't be.
Billy swallowed the last of his beer, threw $1 on the table, and stood up. That's for Kate, he said. And that's a lot for the drink, Jer.
I told you never to.
But Billy didn't hear the rest. He was already halfway to the door. As he reached out to push it open, he spotted Kate coming out of the back room and into the bar. She smiled warmly at him and winked. It was chilly outside, but during his walk home, Billy hardly felt it. Whew! That is where we are stopping today, my friends. A good ways into the Gremlins novel. No, I'm sorry, LeBron. Nobody wants any more Sprite cranberries, for fuck's sake. No.
I will eat your ass.
Okay, Alex, you can do that. Friends, family, thank you. Thank you. Thank you for coming today. Hey, how do you do? I've got a show for you. It's called Romper Reviews. So hit that like and subscribe button too. Thanks, y'all. See you next week for part 2 of Gremlins. Again.